Welcome to today's Mindful Healers podcast episode on Heal Your Relationship with Money. A reminder that our podcast is not medical advice.
Today we have a special guest, Erin Gray. She is a former certified financial planner, a former pharmacy tech, who is now a life coach, and I've just today termed you a traveling nomad. She's also a mom and a wife and a daughter, and literally, and you may be other things too, literally about to follow her dream and move to Maui in days away. So thank you for joining us before you go on your trip.
Thank you for having me.
Our intention today is to encourage you to mindfully notice your relationship with money. And if there are any aspects of it that might need some compassion, some understanding, some healing, some love.
We hope you'll discover that the feelings you have about money, and many that you may not even be aware of, are shaping your lived experience immensely. And that showing yourself compassion and non-judgment around these stories and your lived experiences is the path to liberation, lightness, and change. We hope you'll take away from today's episode that a new, healed relationship with money is possible, and that the path to that is through mindfulness, compassion, and tenderness. So to start, I just wanted to share the story of why I invited Erin on the podcast as a guest. And it's because I met Erin in a coaching session myself, and she coached me on money, and we'll talk a little bit about that experience, but she opened my mind. And I've heard other people say that I have opened their mind, and my experience with Erin was literally a complete mind-opening, different perspective with money and a different way of relating to money. So I have previously heard tons of money coaching, and this money coaching was very different than anything I'd ever gone through. So it wasn't focused on reaching financial independence. It wasn't focused on accomplishing or getting farther faster. It wasn't focused on how to invest in real estate or blow past your limiting beliefs or believing that things were possible. It was about healing your relationship with money and seeing your relationship and approaching it with tenderness, which is her word, but I really like it. And as many people who listen know, I'm all about listening to your heart. And I had never put the idea of approaching money in a heart-centered way or in a tender way as a way forward around money. And for me, it was the thing that got me past a lot of that stuckness in the other ways of approaching money. And so it really helped me see that what I was missing was compassion. And bringing mindfulness and non-judgment and healing and tenderness, sort of heart-centered approach to money, was really my path forward. So we talk a lot about mindfulness here. And as I was thinking about what I wanted to share and what we wanted to talk about, it struck me that a lot of the tenets of mindfulness all actually apply to money. And I hadn't really thought about it until today in that perspective. And so curiosity and generosity and patience and acceptance and intention and compassion and kindness. And Nietzsche, you can let me know which ones I forgot. I'm just sort of throwing them out there, but they all are relevant to healing our relationship with money. So as we get into what will be more of a conversation, I wanted to start off talking about shame, trauma, and guilt, and our own stories around money. So you realize this is a very different podcast around money, because that's not usually where we start, is shame, trauma, and guilt, and perhaps healing that and moving forward in a different way. So Erin, maybe you want to start just explaining how you came to thinking about money this way and your own lived experience.
Yeah. So my probably very first memory around money was around when I was about 10. My dad had always been self-employed, and they had plenty of money. We would live probably an upper middle class lifestyle. And then there was some things that changed in his business or within, him. And we went from having money to not having money. And it was a very, very stressful time during that time. And my dad looking back now, of course, he was trying to teach me and help me, like, don't get in this position, but he let me in on lots of information. And, at the time I didn't realize it, but my body was absorbing all of this, this interaction between him and my mom and what was happening. And so that was a stored memory for me. And so from that space, I have always been very focused on money, but from a very, like, I don't want to be in that position. I never want to experience what my parents experienced. So I would say from a very, fear-based scarcity place, all of my decisions through my life have been from that place. It determined, what kind of career I chose. And, constantly, I would say that it was probably the only thing not the only thing I've thought about, but very focused on money, saving money, investing money, trying to do all of these coping mechanisms is what I call them, right? To try to eradicate this fear that I had within me. And so it wasn't until this past year that I actually took time off from coaching, from, like, completely, if you call it a sabbatical, that I really got into deep diving. I mean, that's really why I got into coaching 3 years ago, because my husband and I were flipping a house. And even though we were making money on the house, there was just this deep fear within me that we are going to, and I say this in air quotes, run out of money, because that was my experience in childhood. So whether my parents said it or whatever, there was a point in time where little Erin decided you could run out of money, or that was the story that I developed. And so that narrative has always been in my mind on replay. And so I was having panic attacks when we were flipping this house, to the point where I was taking my husband, he's had some Xanax, and I was just living on his Xanax. And because I just was like, I cannot, like, physically in my body, I could not focus and do anything. It was just all consuming. If anybody has experienced anxiety, you know what that feels like. And that's what originally got me into coaching, because I was like, I can't live the rest of my life like this. So of course, I dived straight into everything else but dealing with money, healing my money relationship, all of the other things in my life. If you want to call it, improved, evolved, but money was what I really did not face head on, if you want to call it that. So this past year, I decided, a friend of mine suggested, like, what if you just took a couple of months off, which everyone talks about, not stopping your business and not doing that. But I was willing, and 3 months turned into 6, which turned into 9, which turned into, we're now at a year. And that has really given me the space to really heal my, a lot of my money. I don't want to say issues, because that to me has a negative connotation, but, my money narrative, because I think at least for me, being busy, saving, investing, making money, those are all things that distract you from actually, it's a way to buffer, right? And when I took away all of those addictions, right? When you are using your investments to live off of, when you aren't saving, when you aren't making money, when you're not working, there's no distraction for you to have to not really come face to face with things that we need to heal and work through. So this past year, I mean, I've spent, and it's not like I'm sitting in a room, crying the entire time. I've traveled, I've done lots of things, but it has given me the space that I never allowed myself to have, to heal some of those wounds that were, buried, I would call them buried deep,
And you went so far as to become a certified financial planner in order to have control over money and not lose money and not know what to do and not have that happen to you. So it's really interesting how our money stories color our lives and our life choices.
Very much.
And from
Go
a
ahead.
not knowing place, you probably didn't realize that that's why you went that way, but
Yeah, I for sure, you know, like I said, my dad did it from a place of empowerment, right? Like he didn't know that, look, this could really, you know, have some effects on a 10-year-old, right? Sharing this kind of information. He did it for like, listen, don't get in the same position. So he did it from a place of empowering. But at 10, you know, you're not, we all know the way the brain works. Your brain and your emotional system isn't prepared for that. And so, yeah, going into financial planning, you know, going into saving and investing and knowing all of those things and really making sure that I wasn't ever going to, and I say air quotes, I don't know if this shows up on video, but, you know, like to be in that position, but it was always from a place of fear and never from a place of love. And I think that's the difference that a lot of people don't talk about money. I mean, I think one of the biggest, and I'm not the best with words, so help me out here. Misnomer comes to mind, but this might not be the right word. But, you know, people will say, well, your net worth is indicative of your self-worth, which I think is complete and utter bullshit, because I think a lot of people have a lot of money and we have low self-worth. I know that was true for me. And so this idea that because we have money, we feel good about ourselves, or that we, you know, don't have scarcity, you know, whether we don't know where our next meal is going to come from, or the belief that our brains think that, our brain and our body knows no difference. So whether we physically are experiencing scarcity or we believe that we are, right? Because mine was always a belief, it never was. But the belief that I was going to run out of money will always keep you in that space. And so I think it's easy to do a lot of work mindset wise on it. Like, I mean, I got coached plenty of times, years, right? But until I was actually ready to look at those fears, feel those traumas, right? That had those emotions that I had stuffed so deep down inside, I don't think that the real change came from me experiencing those emotions, not from a mindset place.
And I hear from so many that if they knew more, they would feel better. I just need to learn. And so one thing that pops up in your story is you knew all about it and you still didn't feel better. And so that it comes to mind that I think we often go to learning and consumption as a way to feel better. And it's really buffering in many ways. And it's not that knowledge that we have, or if you get a good financial planner, you'll feel better and everything will be fine. You know, it's the mindfulness around it.
Well, I think knowing is equated to like doing, right? But being, how are we being with money? How are we being with ourselves, right? Like you just said, I can tell you all of the stocks and the mutual funds to invest in and how much you need to save and all of that kind of stuff, right? And clearly I am evidence that doesn't equate to financial security, because I didn't feel safe within myself. I didn't feel safe within my body. And that is what I don't think a lot of people are teaching, that we think like, here we go outside of ourselves. It's an external thing we need to do, but really we have to take it inward and be like, who are we? What are our primary emotions that we feel when we think about money? And a girlfriend and I were talking about this today. If you were to look at my life, childhood wise, you would say, if I were to take an ACE test, I wouldn't score very high. I'm like a 2 or a 3. But money trauma is a thing. And I don't think a lot of people discuss that. You know, we think of traumas as physical or verbal or sexual or, you know, accidents, things of that. But money trauma is a thing. And I think it often gets ignored because we can sometimes also be like, well, I didn't have that bad of a childhood kind of thing. And we kind of, I call it like beat ourselves up with the grateful stick, right? Like we're not actually here we go back to tenderness, right? That scared little girl that didn't know what was going to happen with her family and where they were going to move and what was going to be, she was scared, but we don't teach how to kind of work through those things. It's more so like, well, what do you need to learn? What do you need to do? But if you still feel scared and you still act from a place of fear, you're going to just continue to recreate that.
So Nicheng, I'm interested in hearing your story, and I think I'll put the caveat in that it's not like the comparative suffering or the comparative struggling. I think we all have like very different childhoods and very different experiences with money, and each of us, I think, has a different kind of money trauma, if you want to call it, or money imprinting and in our body. And so to hear that three women from totally different backgrounds all ended up needing, I think the moral of the story here is compassion and tenderness and healing, is a really powerful thing to be aware of. Do you want to tell us your money story?
Yeah, absolutely. And so much of what you said, I resonate with, Erin, very deeply. And I love that you labeled this as what's our money narrative. So that underlying curiosity is super important to begin that healing process if we wanted to change our relationship with money. So my story also stems very much from a fear-based narrative. It really developed from growing up as an immigrant, rather poor. So I came to the US when I was 5, and I came luckily with my parents and my brother. So our whole family came, and we had 4 suitcases. So my dad and my mom had really well-paying jobs and secure, joyful jobs that they gave up to basically give my brother and I a broader expanse of opportunities. I remember the day after we arrived in the States, my dad getting on my uncle's bike and biking to the nearby mall to basically cut meat for the eatery that was there. So he was a public health pharmacist at the time. So it's funny that you're also from a pharmacy technician background, Erin. I find that synchronicity really cool. And so for me, money was a certain source of stress growing up. Like there wasn't even a time frame where I can truly say that I felt abundant in my money narrative growing up. So part of that reason was because my parents argued about money a lot. I remember one huge argument that they had when I was in 3rd grade, where my mom bought me a trapper keeper, which apparently they're like coming back in vogue right now. And it was a huge blow up. My dad was furious that she had bought me this trapper keeper for school. And so you can see that that point on, I kind of was afraid to like ask for anything because it was such a tumultuous result in my mom like gifting me this trapper keeper. And so that's why money for me growing up was associated with a lot of stress, scarcity mindset, and really instability because it led to so much of marital discord. And my air quotes, talking about air quotes, growing up was you can't around money. You can't buy this, you can't buy that. You can't do this, you can't do that because it's going to cost XYZ. And even as my parents became more settled in earning a living, in getting better paying jobs, there was still this kind of background, this undercurrent of scarcity. And then on top of that, this like need to control. And it didn't feel spacious at all. I will say though, I try not to beat myself up also with the gratitude stick, but I will say that my dad's mantra growing up that's been like emblazoned in my mind is to get a good education so that you can get a license to practice whatever it is that you're going to practice for a job. And that for him was like the key to financial stability, was to get a license. And for me, my money story changed more when I started earning my own money from being a babysitter in my teenage years to a pharmacy clerk, stocking cat litter and stocking the shelves of a pharmacy department in a grocery store, to a pharmacy technician, where I started, that was really where I started to feel a bit more free. And then going into college and medical school, where I couldn't really work at that time, I'm again grateful for my parents for having gifted me much of my tuition and living expenses in that time frame. But then becoming a resident and a fellow, earning what seemed like 50 cents an hour, there was still even this responsibility and frugal freedom, like that I called it, that I enjoyed. So for me, I transitioned from a foundation of the scarcity mindset and stress about money to independence in being able to make a living off of my own earnings. And now it's been a source of freedom. And I would say that that's probably my evolution. But even still, even after these decades of being in the States, that past scarcity mindset definitely pops up. And it usually definitely is a means of self-defense or protection when it does pop up. So I do show compassion to that. But I do have to consciously, like mindfully remind myself of the facts about my present moment experience, how far I've come, how far my family has come in our journey, and really now being able to say that money affords freedoms for me and can be viewed more from a lens of love and abundance as opposed to fear and scarcity. So that is my money narrative.
And I just want to point out that I think that you have gotten there likely because of your mindfulness journey, and that you are an exceptional practitioner of mindfulness for, a number of different reasons, but that's probably been an integral part of your journey in healing your journey with money.
It's definitely helped with the process. And it's interesting that you say that, Jessie, because it wasn't an intentional aspect that I set out to do about money, but it was kind of interwoven with like my cancer survivorship journey, where I couldn't make any money for a year because I was getting chemo and surgeries. So yeah, it kind of became integrated into the mindfulness journey. So thanks for
I think that's the really cool thing about the mindfulness and all those components, is that when you apply them to anything, they filter over into these other areas. So if you approach yourself with kindness and compassion, and you know how to feel your feelings, for example, then you can process these different bumps along the way or different areas of your life that are sort of your trigger area. So it strikes me as this has come up a few times. And I think that what I see for you is that it filters into every nook and cranny, my favorite saying, right? The mindfulness. And so whenever things come up, you just go right back to that mindful presence about money. And what do I need to feel? What do I need to process? And what do I need to move forward? And so that you get all of these unintended benefits when we practice it.
And it's not even about need. It's like recognizing and giving ourselves the space to acknowledge what the present moment experience is.
Yeah. And what also strikes me here is hands wide open, right? You talk about that in mindfulness. And if you approach money that way, and you're comfortable with approaching things that maybe you don't initially feel safe or secure about, that's a really valuable tool. So I'm trying to think what my money narrative is. And I think one thing is, it sounds like everybody's parents argue about money.
Mm-hmm.
And that might be a universal truth. And maybe all humans, have their own narratives. And so of course our parents argue about money. And, my money story growing up, and what I also wonder now is like how much of it was true, I don't even know, but there was definitely an undercurrent of scarcity. And my parents both came from sort of waspy East Coast families, but they moved out to California, Berkeley in the 70s. And my dad became a teacher, and in their VW bus with, just kind of a very alternative story. And so we lived this very alternative life that didn't, by report, didn't have a lot of money. I'm not sure I ever knew how much money we had or didn't have, but I knew it was a tremendous source of stress and everybody was worried about it. And I should worry about it too. And I think that, so there was always the conversation, that what would happen and we have to be careful and you never know. And so that just sort of that undercurrent, which I don't think any parent intends to traumatize their children. And yet you just hear so many parents sort of talking about, we talk about why you can't have it because, we don't want to spend money on something like that. But it's usually another reason, we don't want them to actually be eating more ice cream or whatever, but we always relate it to money, or you can't do that for this reason, or you shouldn't do that, or those kinds of things. And so I think for me, I grew up with very much a scarcity mindset. And the reality of it is I actually don't know whether it was needed or not, but it was very much felt. And I also wonder how much of it is what you internalize versus what people actually said. Now that I'm more in tune with coaching, I don't even know what they said. I know what I heard and I know what I felt. And so I think it's just so fascinating to know that our narrative, it really is a narrative. And in some ways, it would be interesting to know what the reality was. But what I also think is interesting is I think that we often react to what our parents did. And so my parents actually lived their dream. And so I sort of went towards stability because I watched someone who lived their dream. And I think, Nicheng, you probably went towards a more stable job after watching your parents have some instabilities. And so I just think that we react to sort of what we saw, and that at some point in your life, you wake up to the fact that you reacted. And then you wonder, okay, well, what is it that I really want? And that's kind of a powerful and intriguing story. So what I thought we should go from here is really talking about this possibility of healing your relationship with money. And what Erin said that was so powerful to me in that first session, well, she said a lot of things, but the one that I think that's worth having a conversation about here is this idea of how you feel about money. And I think all of us brought up that we didn't feel safe and we didn't feel secure. And we had this sort of stress about money. And so you asked in that session, how do you feel about money now? And I'll just be full disclosure. I wrote down things like small, stupid, anxious, afraid, stressed. There were a few more, but that's what I wrote down. And when you ask, well, how do you want to feel about money? I want to feel good or relaxed or that it's fun. And you asked the question about like, what's the purpose of money? And I was like, well, the purpose of money is clearly not to stress about it all the time, and clearly not to feel small and stupid. And when you ask that question, one of the things that came up is I realized I felt that way even if if I spent it, if I saved it, if I earned it, if I didn't, if I gave it away, if I kept it, like it didn't have anything to do with the amount of money in the bank account. It didn't have anything to do with my ability to earn it. These were really sort of deep-seated fears about money, or maybe neural pathways about money. And so what I found really helpful was just this idea of getting from how you feel about money now to how you want to feel. And Erin came as a guest coach in my small group coaching. And what I actually really appreciate about this session was I realized I was not alone in like the words that everybody shared there about how they felt about money were right in line. Irresponsible, guilty, a lot of gratitude for having it, but there was a lot of mixed emotion, conflicted emotion, and stress. And so I'm imagining that many of the people listening have many of those similar feelings. And so the tools that you sort of shared to get from one to the other, I think are very different than what we usually think of around money coaching. So I was wondering if you would share your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think money is such a beautiful thing because it's like the flashlight into who we are, right? Like how do we want to feel and how do we currently feel is like, who are we being, right? Like if you were to think about on a general everyday basis, that anxiousness or fear, probably it might show up in money, but it shows up in other things as well. So asking ourselves, who's that woman that feels, what were some of the emotions?
Small.
Yeah, small and, anxious and guilty. You probably experience emotions in other places too. Money was just the circumstance or where it shows up, right? So who are we being? And this is why it's so important. It's like, it doesn't matter how many classes you take or how much knowledge you have. It's like, how do we want to be ourselves on a daily basis, right? We want to feel joy and we want to feel free and easy and flow and movement, right? Like, and thinking, and I'm not one to advocate to like go back to our past over everything that's happened and dig everything up, right? But when something comes up, when you are triggered, when you look at your bank account or you look at or you want to buy something, but you're like, ooh, but that you're feeling guilt for buying it. What is that triggering inside of me that I have that's causing that, right? And questioning that narrative. And this is why I think, when you talked about like with financial planning, for me, it's like we're taught we're supposed to invest and we're supposed to save for retirement and all of these things. But like, what about living right now? And I'm not advocating to just go blow all of our money and all of that, right? But part of it is to enjoy life right now. And I think sometimes we get so focused on the future, we kind of forget how to be currently in the present and how do we want to be. And so, it's really just like you talk about the mindfulness is like, how do I want to feel on a consistent basis about money, and allowing when those emotions that aren't in alignment with how we want to feel, allow that to come up into this tenderness, right? So when you feel guilt, there's probably a narrative or a story that if you got something you really wanted, that might be selfish, or that you're not supposed to, go for something that big, or there's stories there that cause you to feel, not that story makes you feel that way, right? But that internal that you have, that story you have is where that guilt comes from. So really kind of examining and picking apart, why am I feeling this way? Where does this come from? To kind of work through and heal some of that stuff so that you can feel, what do we want? I think, and lots of people have said this before, but like money is supposed to flow, right? This accumulation, like I'm reading Richard Rudd, he's an author of Gene Keys, and he talks about there's a difference between wealth and prosperity. Wealth is more like this accumulation of it, right? But if you think about water, anytime we accumulate water, we dam it up. That's where bacteria happens. That's, like things, water is meant to flow, as is money. And this idea that we need to gather as much, it's like food. We don't store 40 years of food when we retire, because we're never going to have food ever again. But that's kind of what we've been taught in society, that we need to save for retirement. And when you retire, you're never going to make any more money. And this idea that money is outside of us, like we're the magic, right? We are money. But we have been taught that it comes from our job, or it comes from our investments, or it comes from making this good real estate deal, and so really just examining, and that comes back to feeling, right? I think money can be a very intellectual thing, but really feeling what do I feel when I use it, when I save it, when I invest it, whatever it might be.
Can you share a little bit about the difference between sort of changing your mindset about money and changing your feelings about money, and why you feel one is more helpful potentially, or leads to the other?
And I think we can do a lot of changing our thoughts around money, but that allows us to, and I'm like putting a little, right in our heads, right? But feeling it in our bodies, how do we want to actually feel, or how do we feel? That allows those stories that we have stored, like Michine has mentioned, or you have mentioned, I've mentioned, right? Like that fear is stored in our body, and our bodies remember. And so really allowing those feelings that we are feeling to come up and to come out. I mean, Jessie and I have talked offline before, but our feelings, we repress them or we suppress them, right? So really allowing ourselves to experience what that feels like. And going back to trauma, right? Like trauma isn't what actually happened. Like that event isn't the actual trauma, but it's that disconnection that we have with ourselves. And that's what happens when, like when our parents argue and we feel that in our bodies remember that. So allowing ourselves to feel that fear, allowing ourselves to feel the guilt and to process that, versus I want to think differently about money, but the feelings are still within our body.
And feeling into the body is such a foundational practice in mindfulness. Like we spend so much time in the mindfulness-based stress reduction class on the body scan. I think oftentimes we jump too quickly to compartmentalizing and making everything very cognitive and trying to logically figure this out, when we ignore and when we don't honor the emotions around our money narrative. That actually is a disservice to us. So thank you so much for calling that out.
And it really comes back to safety. I mean, at our core, right? It is teaching our bodies to feel safe, because throughout our childhood, throughout social conditioning, it was unsafe to be in our bodies, right? Because what do we want as a human species? We want love, connection, and belonging. So when we feel an emotion that doesn't connect with a parent, right? When we feel anger, when we feel whatever, and we get reprimanded for feeling that, that's not safe anymore, right? It's not safe to be who we are. And so we disconnect and betray ourselves, to keep that connection. And so it's really teaching ourselves that we are safe, and that those are allowed to be there. And it's more of a loving guide to kind of take a look at, why is this coming here, versus I shouldn't be feeling this way. So kind of like a roadmap, I guess.
One of the other things that popped up so much in this conversation is being, rather than doing, or rather than sort of overthinking it. It was just being. And that's a major, we talk a lot about being versus doing, being in the moment and experiencing and embodying what's happening. So it's interesting to me that money requires that same presence. This idea of being present with money and present with your feelings about money, and showing up for money with compassion and with intention and with the noticing, and all of that is a really different way, I think, of approaching it, but is the path to healing.
Well, I think it's very easy to, when we think about the future, it's an escape, right? So being present, being with our breath, being with those sensations that we feel in our body, you can't do that and be thinking about the future, right? And I think as a society, for so long, we value, what are you doing, right? When you meet someone, it's not like who you be, it's what do you do for a living, right? That is, at least in the Western culture, I should say, that is very much like who you are, right? That is your worth. What do you do? What do you contribute? Versus who are you? And I think for me, it was an escape, right? If I could plan ahead, if I could envision my future, if I could do all of these things, I didn't have to feel a lot of those scary feelings that I wasn't used to feeling, because I could think about the future.
I think that's the perfect transition to our questions, unless do you have another comment, Niching?
Oh, just that an underlying theme that I'm picking up on is a lot of the suffering that all of us have described related to our money narratives, I think comes from the over identification of money equating to security and worth. And then there is
Yes.
a desire to like negate that or deny its existence. And then that's where that disconnect and misalignment comes. And then that creates even more suffering. And then when we try to quote unquote fix that by denying our money narratives and not letting our money narratives get the airtime and letting us feel the feelings, then we have this tendency naturally to kind of live in the future, as you had mentioned, Erin, about money, because it feels safe for us to do that. And then also to have rumination about the past. So living in the past and living in the future when the answer is right here, right now, regardless of what emotion or body sensation is coming up for us about money.
Yeah,
So
there's
thank you for that.
there is a, and I'll find it and I'll let you know, Jessie, maybe you can put it in the show notes, but it's what they call suffering, right? And it's, I don't know if you've heard of it, like the 2 arrows. But basically the first arrow is the thing, right? Whether we get sick and we're experiencing illness. And then the second arrow is when we think we shouldn't be feeling this way or it shouldn't be like that. That is what continues, like you say, Miching, the suffering versus, like you just said, it's the first arrow is just being with where we are right now and allowing that versus shoulding or past or present or escaping whatever it is to not be in the present.
Thank you so much, Erin, for being here. And as always, for our dear listeners, we like to close our podcasts with some reflection questions.
What is your current relationship right now with money?
Do you feel safe and secure?
How do you feel about money right now?
How do you want to feel about money?
What is money for?
Is it okay to spend money on the present, for a present? Is it okay to spend money on fun? Thank you again, Erin, so much for this poignant, honest, heartfelt conversation. If our listeners want to learn more about you, how can they get in touch and how can they follow you?
First of all, thank you so much for having me. I love to talk about money. And they can follow me on Instagram, just Erin Gray Coaching, ERINGRAY Coaching. And then that's my email as well, eringraycoaching@gmail.com.
Great. We'll be sure to put those in the show notes as well. And as always, if you enjoyed our podcast, please follow us, share, and leave us stars and reviews. We appreciate your support. At the time of this recording, we just had our 25,000 download milestone last week. So thank you so much.
And if you are in healthcare, we would love to have you join us at the Mindful Healthcare Collective. There are over 2,400 members of that group now, and we would love to include you. We would also love to meet any of you who want to join us for some mindful healing at our first ever Connect in Nature retreat this summer in July at Green Gulch Farm.